Hello guys, and welcome back. For those of you who are new to the channel or unaware, this is the book seen within the evidence photos that Shanann purchased for both herself and Chris Watts. From what we can see in the photos, it appears he never even cracked open the book and just tossed it into the trash. As we begin to discuss Chapter 1, I encourage you to objectively review this with the emotional roller coaster in mind that both Chris and Shanann were on. Shanann is trying to figure out how to desperately connect with her husband, and Chris with emotionally being so connected to Kessinger and seemingly disconnected from his wife. I've shared my opinions along the way, and this last part caught my attention. Like many who have followed this case, this brings about some questions. Number 1, what date did Shanann download the book for herself? Number 2, did it ever show what chapter she had already read, etc.? Audible and Amazon keeps track of your progress with ebooks. Number 3, how does Shanann like to read a book? Was she a bookworm and would cozy up on the couch and read? Or did she skim through the books and use the content for her network marketing, inspiration, etc.? I asked these questions and feel they would give more insight into who she was as a person and how hungry she was for this information found in the book. Her friends described her as not being herself that weekend and staying primarily in the hotel room. N.A. mentioned Shanann was sitting on the front porch waiting for her to arrive to pick her up to go to the airport. Did she already have this book on her Kindle and was trying to finish it so she could offer something positive to her husband back home? Was the letter she left Chris indicative of her already starting the book? The trip away that was planned the following weekend, was that a chance to reconnect emotionally? We have seen in texts found in Discovery that she was very confused emotionally and desperate to get home and fix what was wrong. For some reason, I can picture her curled up in a hotel room devouring this book and attempting all the things to get him to come around. Was the first glimpse of this seen during the trip to North Carolina? Was this seen only during the time she was gone? Or doesn't this take you back to some text messages and very descriptive note left on the kitchen counter? She notes several times she will fight for her marriage and for her family. Think back to the video with the purple shirt. If you haven't listened to it, go listen to her pep talk. What are your thoughts? Drop them in the comments below. As I began reading Chapter 1, I can imagine the gut punch Shanann must have felt as she began reading what she purchased to help her marriage. Here's the tricky part. We have to remember she was a human being with real emotions as well as real behaviors. This chapter furthermore gives us insight into Shanann's upbringing by way of her own videos and posts. Just a quick recap of the opening credits of this book. It is made abundantly clear that the deprivation of an essential or perceived need for both a child or an adult can result in adverse behavior. This is completely the opposite of the research Shanann had previously been exposed to or on the receiving end of. Before we jump into it, I challenge you to take a quick inventory of the way your own parents raised you. Got it? Now, for the sake of keeping things transparent, I'll tell you I grew up in a small southern town that it didn't matter what race or ethnicity you were. If you got in trouble and ever heard the words, "just wait until your dad gets home," well, you already know. And I laugh at it now because, boy, back then, did I know I was in some trouble. I did take some whoopings when I was a kid, and I still grew up very close to my parents. My mother was my best friend, and I respect my father greatly. I still love them both very much. Did it change my approach to my own children? In many ways, it did, and in others, I wouldn't change a thing. Now back to your own memory. How did you change your approach, if at all, for your own children versus how your parents were with you? Now hold on to that thought as we work through Chapter 1. Dr. Sue begins this chapter by defining what, in quote, love is, end quote. She mentions how often the word is used, but poses the question, what really is love? She then goes into several examples from different time periods describing how each identified love. Then it gets interesting. This book literally has me ready to conduct my own survey and experiment on postpartum depression in several aspects of this chapter. Dr. Seuss states we can no longer afford to define love as a mysterious force. It has become too important. For better or for worse, in the 21st century, a love relationship has become the central emotional relationship in one's lives. She then attributes this to increasingly living in social isolation. Most of us no longer live in the supportive communities. We work longer hours, commute farther distances, resulting in less and less opportunity to develop close relationships. She states more often the couples in her practice that she sees live in a community of two. Sound familiar? Additionally, think about our time during COVID. Yes, we were in contact via social media and computers, but how amazing did it feel getting back out there and in person? You could feel the difference in the interactions. Shanann and Chris moved to Colorado and were in fact a community of two. It makes you think about when did the friendships with neighbor Nate and even NA originate? How did they come about? Something tells me it has something to do with around the time period Shanann's parents were living with them. Consider this, when they are no longer a community of two, they are essentially forced to meet and greet neighbors. One neighbor interviewed on body cam footage recognized her and the girls, but never had a personal relationship with them. If in fact NA was a friend of Sandy's and then later a friend of Shanann's, then that friendship originated by way of Shanann's mother. I believe in Chris's February interview he states that they really didn't even know neighbor Nate. So how and why did he have the Russek's number so easily accessible? Besides the obvious that while they were staying with her in Colorado, the Ruseks are southern and pretty friendly. It takes nothing around my neck of the woods to start up a conversation and leave feeling like best friends with the right people. Keep in mind that around the time the Ruseks were there, Frankie Jr. was helping Chris put up the fence out back and things of that nature in the kids' play set. So it would not surprise me if while the Ruseks were there, they got to know Nate, and that's how that friendship or that contact was at least made. Back to the book. In 2006, National Science Foundation survey reported that the number of reported people in their circle of confidence was dropping, and there was a growing number of people stating they had no one to confide in. That's pretty scary. Inevitably, we now ask our lovers for the emotional connection and sense of belonging that a grandmother could get from a whole village. Ever heard the saying, it takes a village? According to the book Hold Me Tight, that village still very much remains an asset to be had even as adults. I believe these days we call them our tribe, but it's the same thing. She speaks on the saturation of movies and the search for love, and the influence on how others define what love is. Romantic love is deemed the end-all, be-all form of love by way of TV screen and advertisements. I'd like to send Chris Watts a copy of the Love Languages quiz and see which one he is. I know it changes with time, and I know Shanann posted it on her Facebook, so in my opinion, I'm sure they completed this quiz at some point together early on in their marriage. Maybe after Bella was born? I say this because something everyone tiptoes around is the tidiness of the home, how everything is always organized, clean, and how she cooks the home-cooked meals, etc. I question his love language being acts of service or words of affirmation, and much like many others, they twisted what that meant. She spent her days putting his needs for this love connection above everything, including finances. Listen to this direct quote from the book. People recently surveyed in Western societies rated a satisfying love relationship as their number one goal in life, ahead of financial success and satisfying career. Again, people recently surveyed in Western societies rated a satisfying love relationship as their number one goal in life, ahead of financial success and satisfying career. Shanann suffered a loss of her first marriage early on, and unless you have ever grieved a loss of a marriage, I will ask you to hold your opinions on the subject. Divorce is really like a death. It's the death of a life you once lived, and you have to reestablish your own identity outside of marriage. Emotionally, it can be brutal, and now with children involved, it makes perfect sense that she would prioritize their marriage over anything else. Is this the right way to do things? obviously not headed for a second bankruptcy, but we will talk about that another time. Back to the book. Doesn't this mirror the same idea of love that Shanann displayed for her former husband? She willingly set aside her own ambitions and goals to support her husband to get through law school. These are her words, not mine, and we do not have anything to dispute this. Even her ex-husband did not dispute this claim when interviewed by police. Working hard and aiming to please, to feel good enough, and then once the mission was complete, things began to unravel in that marriage. She began to grow distant, per her ex-husband's testimony. It's my opinion that at this time, I'm sure the topic of children had been mentioned at some point. Maybe he wasn't ready for kids. Without that next step, what was there for her to do? How was she to express her love to him when up to that point in her life, the only way she knew to express her love was physical intimacy, social settings, and hard work to support his career goals? Her next love would be her North Carolina home. That she speaks so proudly of when she mentions she worked her tail off. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but I've done my share of studying behavior patterns, and this book just makes some come through glaring. Think about it this way. Shanann married this man right out of high school. That's that ooey-gooey love. Then when real love began to shine through, she found herself showing the love by working hard to provide for the man. As long as she worked, he got the education, and she felt the attachment, and therefore she felt loved. When her acts of service were no longer valued, it would make sense that she felt the disconnect. A tidy house with just two of you is not as impactful than when you have a family of 4. She withdrew and, per his interview, turned to work and on her phone. Then, in efforts to give herself the love she gave to her ex-husband, she goes into the cycle again of work to build the house for herself. Now we all know for the hopeless romantic, you can't just build a house and be filled with love. That isolation is excruciatingly lonely. It's my opinion that this is why she didn't hesitate to sell the house and move out to Colorado. I mean, think about it. You're working for years to build this house and then barely last a year in it before you're ready to up and move. I would be interested to know what her relationship was like with her former in-laws. I believe this information is vital to better understand this season in their lives. If she felt at any point her ex-in-laws were the driving force that led to their divorce, or even an opposing party, it would explain a lot when it came to her feelings of the Watts family. And boy, let's not even touch on Cindy's intuition as a mother. Maybe later. Fast forward to Shanann meeting Chris. She states that in the moment she met Chris, it was a dark time in her life. He was there. She raves about how he cared for her and he met her every need. For someone who just spent years providing acts of service as a means of loving a man in marriage to result in divorce, then to build this beautiful house to continue to feel lonely. So for her to be feeling or receiving this must have made her feel like the absolutely most loved woman on this earth. Then the wedding planning begins. Disagreements happen as they do in all families, and then the thread is born. We will come back to this. Let's get back to the book. A revolutionary view of love emerges. We now know that love is in actuality the pinnacle of evolution, the most compelling survival mechanism of the human species. Because love drives us to bond emotionally with a precious few others who offer a safe haven from the storms of life. It's designed to provide emotional protection so we can cope with the ups and downs of existence. This drives to emotionally attach, to turn to someone we can say, "Hold me tight," is wired into our genes and our bodies. It's as basic to life, health, and happiness as is the drive for food, shelter, or sex. We need emotional attachments with a few irreplaceable others to be physically and mentally healthy to survive. This is a direct quote from Hold Me Tight. This is probably the first time that as a reader and creator, I could feel and empathize with the pain she was feeling that weekend. It breaks my heart to imagine her distraught, sitting in a hotel room, dealing with the realization that here she was again, in her mind, doing all the things she thought she needed to be doing and feel loved. She worked hard when they first got to Colorado. Then she provided the ultimate gift, a baby. This brought joy, happiness, and love to their family, and then the disagreements happened and discord returned with the Watts. Then came Cece, and again, more love, joy, and reconnection with family, forgiveness. Then it's as if the tables switch up a little. Chris has the idea of another baby, which we know from his presentation that's one of his ways he saw to quote-unquote fix a broken relationship, was to have another baby. Did each baby provide the temporary fulfillment for them both to find purpose and feel a love attachment with their spouse? We see this cycle repeat again with the whole quote-unquote nutgate issue. Now reflect back to what I said previously. If this is a cycle, then how does she get the love to stay? If initially the move was to simply displace or cut out the deemed negative influence of family, and now 2 kids in, a house is beautifully organized, appears to support his hobbies, and works hard to help her husband provide for their kids, again, you can think what you want about MLMs. I'm not either for them or against them, because frankly, she could have been at the bottom tier and still making the same that she would have made as a gas station clerk. And you know what? Those are hardworking people. So again, to each their own. Most of us who have tried them in the past will tell you the truth. You will be upside down before you can blink in most of them. However, some people are able to be successful with them. Folks, we have to stop keyboard assaulting someone's job just because it isn't a licensed 9-to-5, have college degrees stacked, etc. Again, think back to the gas station employee. Thank God for them. She's essentially expressing all of her love to him, and yet she's about to lose everything because with a divorce comes loss. From my own personal counseling session many years ago, my marriage counselor told me that divorce is like a death, and you must take time to grieve it properly, or else you will carry it everywhere you go. I can't tell you how many times I was asked, when will you get married again? It was almost 13 years later before I decided to get married. Chris had never been married and barely had a relationship prior to Shanann. Shanann, on the other hand, was no doubt still in a period of grieving her own identity from the first marriage when she met Chris. That divorce took her identity not only as who she was single, but also the Shanann that dated that man, that married that man, and the wife that loved and lost that man. To think that she wasn't battling some form of depression only takes away her power and individuality. And at least on this channel, I will not allow that to happen. I will not diagnose her, but I will share my opinion. The love bomb from Chris, was it narcissistic, or was it a temporary distraction from those feelings of not being good enough that kept her pushing? What about when you and your spouse or even a friend get into a disagreement? The love bomb from Chris, was it narcissistic, or was it a temporary distraction from those feelings of not being good enough that she kept pushing down? What about when you and your spouse or even a friend get into a disagreement? What's your forgiveness rate look like? How do you feel when someone hurts you and then immediately tries to show love with physical or verbal affection? At that point, an honest apology works better than physical intimacy, am I right? Taking a moment to reflect on what and how you're feeling or expressing emotion during the time of hurt or pain is a healthy way to reflect on not only someone else's behavior, but your own. No one controls you but you. When we are speaking of periods of grief, processing emotions, healing, and personal growth, we are all on our own, but with the right partner, we can move forward and grow, or be completely destroyed. Grief comes in all forms, and denial is a huge part of it. Admitting you're still grieving over a loss when everything in you is ready to move forward is not an easy thing to admit. I wonder if Shanann ever grieved that first divorce. And I don't mean that whole I don't need a man mentality, because y'all, that isn't necessarily healthy either. How about you and your relationships? Can you think back to a time where you and your spouse may or may not have been on the same page due to some form of emotional hurt? Have you ever tried to date after divorce? The truth is, no one, and I mean no one, will ever fully know the loss you endured, whether it's a fleeting moment or years. That's between you and God. But to have someone there to confide in and share those feelings in moments of vulnerability, that's love. Clues to love's true purpose have circulated for a long time. The diagnosis failure to thrive was coined by Renee Spates, yet John Bowlby brought the reports in science into understanding. Bowlby took 7 years of psychoanalysis in addition to medical school to further specialize in his study. He really wanted to know his stuff. He expressed that relationships with one's parents did not cause a child to do a certain act. Rather, that relationship taught the child how to respond. Does that not sound like, if you think about it, the line that we've heard, you sound like my mother, or you sound like my father? Ouch. Dr. Sue goes into Bowlby's experience with research, and it is beyond fascinating. I won't go into too much of it because it does get very in-depth within this one chapter. But something she does note is that in 1944, Bowlby published the first paper ever on family therapy. He notes that behind the mask of indifference is bottomless misery, and behind the apparent callousness is despair. 4 behaviors basic to attachment. Number 1, that we monitor and maintain physical and emotional closeness. Number 2, that we reach out to this person when we are unsure, upset, or feeling down. Number 3, we miss this person when we are apart. And number 4, we count on this person to be there for us when we go out into the world. The name of the experiment is The Strange Situation. It's totally worth looking up. There's a whole lot more to go into with it, but I do want to move along throughout the chapter. I will leave this, and that is that Bowlby maintained that adults needed the same form of attachment as children. He discovered that they exhibit the same behavior pattern as those orphaned, and that this need is what shapes adult relationships. When love doesn't work, we hurt. Dr. Sue Johnson. Pretty interesting book so far. I will say the nerd in me appreciates the scientific experiments cited throughout, and additionally, I'd like to point out that this is the book Shanann chose to send to Chris and read herself. Something in this book appealed to her. It's my opinion that during the spiraling text messages, Shanann began questioning everything about their relationship and may have recognized the void in both of their needs. What are your thoughts? Has this book made you think a little more in depth about the case? It's my hope that as we read through this more, that you'll begin to see Shanann and Chris as people and not this character playing a role in a dramatized movie or Netflix documentary. It's a personal opinion that as we better understand and study their mindset and points of views, that we may get a more clear picture on what actually happened that fateful morning. Thanks again for tuning in, and please don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like, and share with others so we can get the message out there. Until next time.